What we're going to be doing today is talking about the future of access, but we're going to be doing it in a very particular way. About 3 years ago, I wrote. I want to quote myself. That's something I've never done before. Instead of the rich and seamless digital library for scholarship that scholars need, researchers today encounter archipelagos of content bridged by infrastructure that is insufficient and often outdated. And my perspective on access is informed by that way of thinking, that we have some wonderful individual publisher platforms, but that collectively the hundreds and indeed perhaps thousands of platforms that scholars encounter just creates a very, very messy dynamic for them. Since then, over the last 3 years, there have been a number of a couple of really interesting efforts to try to address that challenge, probably the most well-known of which is the RA21 initiative that I do have some opinions about that I won't get into today. But the more significant shift that we might want to look to, and which we're going to be trying to focus on today in this panel, is the question of whether there might emerge one or several supercontinents of access to the scholarly literature. What I mean by that is the question about whether there is a way to get a single discovery starting point that also provides in that same platform access to essentially all of the content that a researcher might look for. We're going to have a chance to talk about that at some length today. So imagine one solution here to a kind of scattered user experience being someone creates a platform that allows you to discover and also access directly on that platform everything, regardless of which publisher it's coming from. This may be something that you've all thought quite a bit about, but as we were putting this panel together, that seemed like a topic that we should dig into at some length. So in other words, you could discover all of the gold stuff, you could discover all of the open access stuff, you could discover and access all of the licensed content regardless of publisher. And so this raises some really interesting questions, because it is one way of understanding a solution to the this crazy linking morass and authentication morass that our researchers are faced with. But for publishers, this would raise some really important and I think relatively new questions about what from a publisher perspective is off-platform usage, right? And so the sharing of content off-platform, how to record usage, how to get credit for usage, how to do things in a way that does right by analytics and makes sense for personalization and drives value in ways that make sense for everyone. So how should publishers feel if this is a direction that's emerging? So today we're going to have a chance to talk that through. It's going to be mostly my colleagues on the panel today who are going to be doing the talking. I'd like to get us started with a series of questions, and then we'll hopefully have some time for others who are here today to for you all to contribute Q&A as well. But we're going to start off with a facilitated discussion, and we're going to go from the left to the right with the first question, which is essentially, Gaby, do you agree that this is a kind of emerging dynamic or possibility or strategic dynamic? And for each of the organizations represented here, what are your organizations doing to begin addressing it, if anything? So,
sure, thanks. I think it's a great question, and I think what was interesting this morning was we've kind of built up to this conversation through the day. I think that Judy versus this morning was completely right when she said you need a North Star, and that North Star needs to be the researcher. And at Mendeley, I'm very fortunate to have joined an organization where the researcher really is their obsession. It's what they measure on a day-to-day basis. We have 5 to 10 researchers come in every week and tell us about the kind of problems that we heard about from our guests this morning. And I think what we've learned from that is a couple of things. One is that convenient access to content is everything. And that could be on a mega island of content. But I think what our researchers tell us is they're all different. Their workflows are all different. They work in different domains. They look at different platforms. And what they really want is that content to be delivered conveniently to them in that workflow without endless context shifting between different sites. So we hear that's very important from our users, and from a Mendeley perspective, that's something that we are trying to think about. How do we provide access to content for researchers in the workflow when they're with us? And I think it's often been discussed that open access is part of the answer to that problem. Certainly gold open access makes that easier. But it's definitely an incomplete answer to that problem, because the whole world is not going to be gold open access this year or next. That transition is coming along, but it's certainly going to take some time, and we may never get fully there. So I think we as publishers and as platforms need to think about different solutions to how we use technology and standards to enable researchers to access content wherever they are and whatever platforms they're using. So as Mendeley, part of what we're doing is thinking about how can we expand access to full text within the workflows like Reference Manager, like private groups, to enable researchers to share, collaborate, and annotate. But really importantly, how can we do that in a way that supports publisher business models so that publishers can then go on and solve some of the problems that our researchers asked for help with this morning? And one of the things that we've been thinking really hard about is capturing the usage. When we look at how content is consumed on Mendeley, we see very significant amounts of content consumption on the Mendeley platform. And I think it's important that we start to measure that and capture that and make that available back to the publishers in ways that conform to counter standards, for example, and so that they can use that data both to get insight about content consumption and also potentially to monetize it. So one of the things that we're working on, for example, is distributed usage logging together with Crossref and Counter to make that kind of data available. That's kind of one response to the problem.
So it's kind of interesting because CCC's origin story is in aggregation. Now, this was back in 1978, and it was just about aggregating rights, and no one was even thinking about aggregating content unless that just meant getting something in print and sticking it near something else in print. So it was a different world, and what we discovered probably a good 5 to 10 years ago was, our clients. I'm really going to talk here about the corporate researcher because that's who we're focusing on most directly in this space. They wanted those rights, but they wanted what we sometimes refer to as content at the point of rights and rights at the point of content. So they want to be able to find what they're entitled to, they want to know what they can use it, and they want everything in their workflow. And so we have something sometimes we refer to it as a platform. It's not a platform the way you think of it. Sometimes it's a technology. Sometimes it's a browser extension. But it's what we call the RightFind family, and it kind of does everything you're talking about. So essentially, you can be within RightFind or doing a PubMed Central, Medline search where there's a browser extension. You find a bunch of documents that you want. And what RightFind does is it tells you, okay, this stuff you subscribe to, so you can use it freely. This stuff you don't subscribe to, but your institution actually purchased it, so you can get that. This stuff is open access. This you haven't subscribed to, but you can just buy it through RightFind and get it a minute later. And here's some stuff that, frankly, was published in 1880, and it's not been digitized, and we'll actually go get it for you. So the idea is to enable users to be able to get whatever they want within their workflow. And this is, we have about 8,700 or so organizations that use some variant on this. We're using this to deliver documents, and the way we do it is, Copyright Clearance Center. What do we have to be? We have to be helping publishers with their business model. We have to be completely copyright compliant. And so we've built it in a way that, for example, when you do sharing like in an off-site platform, let's say you're within a work group, and let's say it's perfectly lawful, but there's 10 of you and you're at an institution, you download it, and now you're working it, and the publisher only knows you've got that one download. Well, if you're using the collaboration tools we have in RightFind, everyone who's in that collaboration group gets counted, because when they go to that article, they actually go to the version of record, and so you get the counter compliant view. So then you've got the article, it says what you can do with it. You know, if you have a license from us or you have a license from the publisher, it says what you need to get further permissions to do. So we've got upsell opportunities for reprints and external use and all of that. So I'm going to stop there, but I sort of feel, you know, when you're talking about, you know, it's all about, as you say, seamless for the researcher in the workflow where they want to be. And, you know, we'd love everyone to be in the RightFind workflow, but a lot of people are just going to go onto Medline or Google Scholar. And so you have to just make sure that you can bring all of their documents, everything they're entitled to, get everything in that same workflow. And then the last piece, which is what we've been spending, let's say, the last year on, is once you've got that, then there's this whole other piece of the content, which one of our clients referred to as the where's my stuff. So now they've got all the subscription, all the journals, maybe the books, all of that's in their workflow, but then they have their own internal documents. And then the next stage is bringing all of their internal documents tagged and consistent into that same workflow with the journal articles, because they want to know, am I getting, you know, they want to be able to get their own proprietary research along with the third-party research. So that's kind of what we're looking at, and that's how we're seeing it. We obviously see need in the market because this is what we've been doing.
So, yeah, this is very complex, I think, even if you just want, as a researcher, or maybe larger as citizen of the world, access to science. The thing is that every researcher should have different practice and different, is willing to access differently to content. Of course, what Roy just said seems to be true. I think researchers just want to find the right content and access to the content by, I think it no matters if it is legal or illegal most of the time. You just want to access content. So the work we have to do, and for example at MyScienceWork, that's what we are trying to do, is to provide the user with a seamless access to the content, making sure that this is copyright compliant. I mean, why researchers are going on Sci-Hub today? It's because it's easy to find the content, access the content. And I'm sorry to say that, because I know that I have just in front of me a lot of people that probably disagree with the fact that researchers go on Sci-Hub, but this is a fact now. So I think we really have to think about now, how can we provide an alternative solution to researchers to be sure that they find content with copyright compliance. Once we get that in mind, the other thing is that we talked since this morning about different versions of publication, and that's something that is changing now in the research world. I mean, there is preprint, even I would say working paper, preprint, post, peer-reviewed papers, and blah blah blah, and a lot. And what about providing all these different information to the researcher to be sure that he access to the right version, and always with the idea to get the right license link to the content. And if after we add to that functionalities and features, that can help researcher to deal with his different that he can use to deal with his work daily to daily. I think it will be a nice platform for researcher. And the last thing is that I think there is not only one platform that will be the right one for researcher, but because everybody wants everybody have different practices. But the thing is that different platforms can help researchers to access the content, and this is a good thing that there is different platform. I mean, just one, or if you should just have one, maybe MyScienceWork.com will be the best one, but I think that different one could coexist and be very helpful for researchers.
Hi, I'm Rob McGrath from Readcube and Digital Science. So when I think about this problem, it's there's been a number of challenges have surfaced in the likes of Sci-Hub and other sites today which have lowered the bar dramatically for researchers to obtain content, to the extreme to which it's not uncommon to hear people at very well-subscribed institutions saying that they will go there over going through their library systems just because of the ease of use, the speed at which they can go from a discovery service to the full text. So in some ways, I like to think that that's kind of elevated the problem to a lot of people's attention today. But it isn't just that. I think the access challenge has always been there. And if you go back not that many years, there have been a lot of efforts by various innovators to try to address the problem of how does someone go from a hit of interest to the full text of the content. If I go back to the early days of Readcube as a reference manager, it was a constant feedback from researchers that, yes, this tool is fun and great for organizing my literature and helping me write and cite a paper, but there's this whole body of work that goes in between that is very laborious, staying up to date, and that's where a number of different innovators have emerged and solve a lot of really great problems in the space today around staying up to date, doing surveys and discovery tools and the like. But there's always been this gap between those two things. And it isn't really a publisher problem as much as just a general industry problem. A lot of it is library IT systems that really have not stayed up to the time. I very much echo the sentiment that Roger made in the beginning, that it really is systems that are IP-based, and thus a lot of the initiatives around RA21 and others are really great strides in a direction to solve that. But it really underscores that there's a sort of infrastructure challenge that we're dealing with. And when I think about kind of the question you posed, it isn't so much a need for a central monolithic or end-to-end platform to solve all these challenges, but there really needs to be an infrastructure bit that goes in between and enables researchers to go from organic journeys from many different discovery locations through a sanctioned pathway, whatever that may be, through their library, their commercial organization, to the full text, and then hopefully into other downstream workflows like reference managers and collaboration tools, where all of that usage can continue to be monitored in a sensible way that helps drive and sustain our industry. So to speak very briefly about some of the things that we're doing on that front, it is a topic that has been very close to our heart for a long time. Some of you may remember Readcube Access was a patron-driven acquisition program that we started a couple years back, which was engineered to solve this kind of problem for supplemental access to content beyond a subscription. We've launched a program called Anywhere Access earlier this year, and it's intended to do a lot of the same things that Roy mentioned and right fine, but it's more targeted at academic library IT, whereby it provides integrations with library holdings to solve the question of what do I have access to. It has integration with single sign-on to ensure users are validated against a given institution. And it provides a linking function that connects people to the full text through their easy proxy or other infrastructure bits. We try to abstract that to the researchers so that they don't have to worry about jumping through hoops. And like I said, it's not a new problem. Things like PubGet, Quosa early on with Elsevier. I'm drawing a blank, but there have been many browser extensions, Copernio and others. A lot of people have been trying to solve this in different ways over the last few years. So while Sci-Hub is a new threat, the problem for researchers has been very real. It's only just gotten much easier for them to circumvent IT infrastructure in recent years.
And it's interesting, it's interesting. Try not to rustle. So there's a bunch of different models here. Each one has its own affordances. Each of you is at different stages along a pathway towards trying to address aspects of this problem. It's interesting to see, you know, for example, just looking at Rob, with the way that Dimensions, that Digital Sciences Dimensions was rolled out, with the idea of being able to access the article inside of the discovery system. I think that's sort of another aspect of this, and just, you know, just interesting to kind of think about. So what are some of the barriers that, as you all are trying to chip at various parts of the problem here, what are some of the barriers that you're encountering? Are you finding that it's just a matter of rolling through things as you know, just as much development effort as you can, technical problem, or are there kind of strategic or business challenges that you're faced with?
I would say that what is not a problem is kind of competition between different platforms to try to find the right way to solve user needs. I think it's really good that different people are trying to crack this problem in different ways. I think what would help, though, everyone to go faster is the sort of infrastructure layer and some standards around that infrastructure layer so that things can be more interoperable, particularly around how do you capture and count usage, how do we make entitlements more standardized. Those kinds of things I think are really important and would speed us up a lot, and having kind of transparent, open standards that everyone adopted around that would really help. And implementing some of those is not completely trivial, so I also think that kind of getting a few platforms and publishers to actually get on and do some of these things and prove that they work and then scale is an enabler to all of this.
Yeah.
You can see Rob nodding.
I'm going in any order.
Yeah. You know, I sometimes like to think, you know, what would our industry be like if we had not done Crossref? Like, actually think about what conversation we'd be having if we didn't, 15, 20 years ago? I don't remember. It was Wiley and Academic Press before Academic Press even got bought by Elsevier. You know, and then, you know, others, you know, joined in very quickly because it was so obvious. And that was a really amazing industry solution. And I think, sort of building on what you're saying, Gaby, we do have a history of doing this. And, you know, if we didn't have that seamless reference linking, which was sort of the first step in this sort of workflow management tools, we'd be in a different place. I don't even know what place we'd be. Maybe we'd have some other solution. But I think we do have a tradition here in our industry. I mean, to me, I think the issue is scale. So, you know, I have some statistics. So we have, you know, within RightFind, we have 100 million citations. That's a lot. That's a big number. And then how do you get all of these? You know, you get what you can from the publishers, you get what you can from Mendeley, you do whatever you can. And then that's just the journal articles, right? So now we keep talking about open science. So everyone says, data, we need the data. Well, what are the standards around data? Well, okay, let's be really clear. What kind of data? Is it an IR spectrum, or is it a photograph, or is it an interview? They're all forms of data. So, and now everyone wants data, and you're like, okay, well, we're having enough trouble scaling the article. What about the chapters? Okay, articles, chapters, okay, we're pretty good there. We know what we're doing. What's next? And our, you know, researchers correctly have a voracious appetite for just more. And so one of the challenges I think we find is, like, what are the problems you can solve now? What are the problems that you recognize but just say, I can't do that yet? What are the problems that you'll never be able to solve but everyone's asking you to solve? And separating all of those out is really hard.
On my side, I can talk about, I think, two challenges that we are trying to solve at MyScienceWork. The first one is openness. And when I say openness, it's not only the access to the full text, even if I think it's important, but we can deal with the fact that all the content is not available in open access. But openness is also the access to a different system. I mean, the framework, as you talk, Rob, it's very important. I mean, the system have to communicate together, and the interoperability of data, it's something that is crucial if, I think, publishers want their content visible for researchers. And that's something that we are still struggling, not with all publishers, because most of the publishers now open their metadata and sometimes even give access to the full text. but some are still closed. So the interoperability of metadata is something that is crucial, I think. The second thing is the standards. And even if I heard a lot of times, oh yeah, there is standard on the market now, I can say that I work with very, very expert NLP guy, and they always told me how this data is a mess. It's standard is not here, and there is standard, but everybody don't use the same standard. So it's surely a barrier. It's something that we have to work on.
So I would say that the biggest challenge was kind of what we, based on, like Gaby mentioned, we do a lot of user focus groups, and so the bar that we wanted to think about was how do you provide the same sort of instant gratification that researchers come to expect in consumer media, the likes of Spotify or Netflix or other services, where they're just accustomed to this notion of there's a database that I can click on something and get access immediately to it. How could you set that, and again, Sci-Hub does basically that with one paste. You get one-click access to something virtually instantly. So in a lot of ways, if you're thinking about whatever solution we're entertaining here, it has to satisfy that bar. It has to be one click, easy for researchers to go to the content that they want without having to jump through all these other hoops, log in through different authentication pathways, go back through their library resources, et cetera. You've all seen and read about the challenges and the maze that researchers are often faced with through the library IT infrastructure. So that's kind of the starting point. And if you think about how do others solve that problem, there's a combination of technology in terms of software that can facilitate that, whether it's kind of a built-in one system that does it all or various kind of distributed type systems that work in a federated fashion. There's the availability to deliver content efficiently. And that's a really big challenge in this space, because right now content lives in silos among all of your different sites in different formats. You have underlying XML formats that are inconsistent, and you've got underlying PDFs. Say nothing about trying to get to an HTML first workflow. We're really sort of struggling with a tractable kind of access problem within our current sort of systems. And then the third is licensing. So I would say that licensing is really an interesting challenge because it's hidden behind, well, if you think of the traditional site license model, you have the knowledge bases. And that's a relatively tractable problem that we can work with through technology to like what I mentioned before, synchronizing with libraries to get their holdings so that we can answer the simple question of, does this user have access to this particular document? It's a hard question to answer for any of us up here, and there are no standards for really doing that really well. The CPE project might come into play. But anyway, so I'd say those sort of three challenges of sort of like the technology, the content, and the licensing. And on the licensing front, I would love for there to be kind of out-of-the-box thinking on this topic, because site licenses will get most universities a certain distance, but nobody has access to everything. And the notion that you're going to request content through the library is increasingly difficult. Researchers are straying from library resources and going, as we've discussed, to online resources. Many of you have told me personally that traffic is going down, that the stats are not in the right trajectory, and it's very much a function of these forces at play. So yeah, I think that a solution needs to sort of solve those, and I think the combination of licensing and the ability to deliver content in new ways, and maybe one just thought to think about is over the last many years, I've worked with many of you to create technologies to keep people on your platforms, to make the platforms more engaging, deliver the data more efficiently, et cetera. But a newer concept is how do you go with researchers on multiple platforms? An example of that is the content sharing initiative that we've had the pleasure of working with a number of you on, where you can deliver content on different parts of the web and still track it, still gain visibility, still use it to inform your business decisions. But thinking about how does your content live not only on your platform, but how it could live in other places on the web with trusted third parties that have contracts in play, that provide usage data, all that good stuff, but at the same time are delivering the multifaceted end user experience and access pathways that will fit into workflows that you might not have originally envisioned when these sites were created.
So, it's really interesting to kind of pull together some of the barriers that we've heard. I think there are a couple of themes here, and there's one in particular that I'd like to drill down a little bit into. I think two or three of you were saying the same thing. Gaby, you mentioned entitlements, And then Rob, you mentioned licensing, and I'm not sure if you mean exactly the same thing there, but could we probe into that a little bit more? What exactly is missing and what exactly is needed? I don't know that we want to get incredibly technical today, but I do think it would be helpful to understand what the ingredients there are that aren't fully present right now.
You want to go?
Sure. So yeah, I think I see sort of two separate things. One is entitlements to existing licenses. So working within the frameworks of where we are today, which is super important because that's where the vast majority of content is going to be licensed for the foreseeable future. So just making it easier for researchers and the technologists providing solutions for researchers to be able to answer that question of, does this researcher have access to this resource? And what is the pathway to get them there efficiently and legally? So that's one part of it. The second part of it that I like to think a lot about is, especially talking to small libraries, is how do they deliver a seamless experience to get the content that they do not subscribe to, with the understanding that they're never going to subscribe to everything. And that's where I think creative licensing around on-demand delivery of content is something worth exploring more. There are definitely a lot of parallels in other consumer media. In an extreme camp, you can think of like a micro-royalty program whereby there's like a sort of Spotify-like distribution model. And actually a number of publishers in this room are actually quite keen on exploring some of those programs, which I think could be interesting in a number of specific demographics. But then there's also just more simply, how do we make it more attractive for libraries to engage in unmediated doc-del for researchers to cover the gaps in their subscriptions? And I think unmediated is key, because if it's mediated, it's slow, and they're going to go somewhere else. So it has to be unmediated, and it has to be set at a price point that's not going to threaten your existing business models. So if we just kind of think about what that means, it's somewhere above the cost of probably ILL, but below the cost of retail website pricing that most of you would have and license your content for. And maybe there's a DRM option that can make that more tenable in the short term. Just like a lot of other transitions have occurred with iTunes and others, there are ways to do that. But I do think that for a lot of libraries, there is a sweet spot there that's wholly unaddressed and would be very interesting to explore, and might prove to be something that could generate a bit of revenue that otherwise is being lost, either because of the way that some of the ILL functions work or because of the way researchers are just not even going through the library pathway to begin with.
Yeah, this is interesting because we built something like that, which we call Get It Now, which probably most of the publishers in the room participate in. It's a, they're the hidden costs of ILL. So, we have this notion, which legally I have issues with, that certain number of copies can be basically document delivered from one library to another without the payment of a copyright fee, leaving aside all of that and the legal history of how we got there. It's very costly, particularly for the so-called lending libraries who then have to chase this, and we did these studies where we looked at that system, and it cost at the time $30, $40 for each party, both the borrower and the lender, and by the time it got to the user, it was a week later, and fewer than half the users wanted it. So we built a system. Originally, it was a pilot with Elsevier, and then most of the other publishers joined in, where you could actually do quote-unquote interlibrary loan through this, and it was, the publishers set the prices as always, but often they would charge less than the full document delivery price. And so that is available to pretty much any library, and it's been pretty well adopted. The challenge, I think, is the libraries, since they're the ones paying for it, they don't, in our experience, they want an intermediation level. They say, they want to get it to the user instantly, but they also, don't want to give a blank check to everyone to just run up the bills. And so, it's interesting. The libraries say, "Oh, well, we have to do this disintermediated," but the whole point is it's disintermediated. But once they're paying for it, they want to be intermediated again. And so, I think it is a challenge. It does drive some of this illegal usage, no question. But it's not as simple as that. And so, the person paying wants to have some control.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
We've in the Readcube access model that we did, we tried very hard to set an unmediated pattern whereby libraries could set their budget by attenuating the different delivery formats that they will accept. So it could be a full PDF at a full price, or it could be a DRM limited view-only version of the article, or it could be a rental. And what we found was that libraries would actually set a max budget. They would just put in a price. For instance, I'm not willing to pay more than $14 or whatever the case might be. Mm-hmm. And depending on the price points of the journals and the delivery formats available, we would just cascade that down. And that was a way that we were successfully able to manage those budgets so they didn't blow up pretty quickly. But that's an example of, I think, a flexible licensing model that is worth exploring and experimenting, maybe on a pilot basis. But those types of sort of toggles that you can do so that there's a level of access. It may not be the full-fledged level of access of the PDF unrestricted. And also, by the way, not putting it the PDF is incomparable to the CPD. So we're now suddenly able to sort of have a different conversation about a different level of access that could be potentially upsold later to a full subscription. But the key message, I think, is preventing or getting this to go through a sanctioned and observable, measurable pathway in the first place, because so much of it is not. And anything that is mediated, in my opinion, is going to really suffer usage. You're only going to get the most specific professors asking for the sanctioned pathway from the library because they know the library. Most researchers don't these days. And so it's a real challenge to encourage that behavior.
Anything else on entitlements or licensing?
I mean, I think from our point of view at Mendeley, we're less focused on that angle and much more on what we see as probably 90% of the users who have at some level a subscription through their institution to 90% of the stuff, but still can't get access to it for whatever reason. So we're much more focused on kind of users within our workflow who maybe have saved a reference to their library or who have got a recommendation to stay up to date, but for whatever reason can't access the PDF. And so from an entitlements point of view, what I'd like to be able to do is say, I have a user, I think they're from institution X, they want document Y, dear publisher, please can we pull that for them and standardize ways to achieve that so that we allow researchers to consume articles that are already paid for on their behalf, that they're already entitled to really seamlessly. So that's, I think, a problem that we could and should be able to solve with existing technology. No new technology is required, but a bit of collaboration and a bit of standard setting around how we do that can solve that problem relatively easily, I think.
Yeah,
Not easily, actually, that's the wrong word. Otherwise, we would have solved it already. So some heavy lifting is required, but it isn't advanced technology, I don't think.
Yeah, I fully agree with Gaby. And one other use case that's worth thinking about, I think most of the discussion has been around how does an individual researcher gain access to content. But when you're thinking about groups of researchers collaborating, every time something gets shared within that group, is there a mechanism where we can determine whether that recipient actually had access? I mean, there's the voluntary principles that this group has put forward for lack of a technical solution here. But there could certainly be a technical means by which every time that happens, there is a mechanism. And that's where DUL and CPE start to fit in to solve some of those problems. So it's very much connected with a lot of different workflows.
One of the, as I dug into some of these questions as a user myself, one of the things that I keeps resonating for me in this discussion is the assumption that many publishers have that users have a one-to-one, or not one-to-one, a one-to-many relationship between users and library or institution. And one of the things that I've reflected on is that, you know, as a faculty member, let's say, someone also lives in a town where there's a public library and also is an alumnus of a certain institution. And so they often have entitlements from multiple institutions. I mean, I don't mean to suggest we make the best the enemy of the good here, but it is something worth thinking about. You know, is this all sort of an institutional entitlements problem? Maybe that gets at some of what you all were talking about a few minutes ago, but there's also a sort of individual multi-affiliation question that's embedded in this, I think. Anyway, I guess I'm supposed to ask questions rather than make statements, so sorry. Okay, so I think moving on, I want to think about implications here for traditional publishers, right? I mean, obviously the tenor of the conversation thus far has been really about the opportunities and, the opportunities to drive usage and so forth. Is that essentially the main way that traditional publishers should be thinking traditional publishers, I mean those of us in the room, publishers, not traditional publishers, publishers, as opposed to platform providers, should be thinking about these issues? Or are there, you know, what are the, how should publishers be thinking about the opportunities here? What are the implications for them? Are there any risks that they should be bearing in mind or considerations that they should be thinking through here?
Sure. I would say that there's, in my mind, sort of two interesting challenges to think about. One is, what can we do to coax this trend where people are increasingly going off of sort of library pathways back onto sanctioned pathways? And the obvious answer to me is we need to make tools that are great and a better alternative to what else they have available to them online. And fortunately, there's precedent for that in consumer media. Napster and others were offset by better software tools. It's a different analogy, of course, with a third-party payer, but nonetheless, I do believe that in collaboration with people here and yourselves, that there are technical ways we could accelerate the process of curbing some of that behavior. And then secondly, I think so the first one would generate hopefully more usage, more counter usage, because more people are on pathways that are measurable, monitorable, and that supports your existing business models. I think the second one is just thinking really openly about how does a transactional model fit into supplemental coverage. So for all those customers that are not subscribing to all of the content, either taking a large package or maybe they're buying per journal, is there a way to better support them in that process so that we can provide what feels like a site license but is not a site license? And just to give a quick example of a pilot we did a couple of years ago with Nature that was quite fascinating, we did a program that was an unmediated pilot of content where researchers could gain access to the content immediately. They didn't see a paywall, they just got directly to the content. We provided a little technology layer to make that work. And what happened was when they viewed the content, it would incur one fee, which was basically a base fee for opening the article. I won't get into numbers, but it was a low dollar amount. If they proceeded to read the article, spent a fair bit of time reading it, printed it, saved it, that would incur a higher fee. And so it was a usage-driven pricing model. It was an interesting experiment. We got some really fascinating feedback on it. And if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to talk more about it. But I think things like that play into how do we cover the gaps so that the primary point being that from the user's perspective, they don't see a barrier, they just see a pathway, and that we can use flexible licensing behind that to support the delivery of the content and the measurability of it, and then perhaps if that's successful, there may be better data points come the following year to talk about a better subscription, which is more cost-effective ultimately for the library. But so many of those data points are missing right now, so that kind of conversation is really challenging, especially with disturbing trends.
So I'd say, the risk is obvious, but bears repeating. If you don't make it easy for people to use the content in the workflow, they'll find other content, they'll find another source that's less legal, and you'll lose everything. And you can't really reacquire, the cost of keeping a customer is a lot lower than the cost of acquiring new one, or even worse, trying to reacquire one. So these are the risks, and the good part is, as an industry, we have a tradition of collaborating. We have things like Crossref, things like CCC. We're over that hurdle of we don't want to collaborate with everyone, but there is one more hurdle we haven't gotten over, and everyone always goes to analogies to the music industry, and I'm going to do the same, but I'm going to try to do a little different. I'm going to basically say, think of a couple of your favorite recording artists. Okay. Now, raise your hand if you can name me the recording label that two or more of your favorite recording artists on. Anyone? Okay. There's always, okay, we got a couple people who are really into music and actually know the labels. The labels are the publishers here. The recording artists are the journal brands, the book titles. That's what people want. So imagine if now forget about legal or illegal. Imagine you're committed, you're only going to buy legal music. Now you want to listen to 10 songs. Are you going to go to 10 different publisher platforms to get those 10 songs? I mean, that's crazy. You'll never do that. You'll listen to the radio. It's much easier. And that's what happens. And I do think we still haven't gotten out of that kind of publisher brand thinking. You know, and look, I mean, I go back to, you know, when I worked for a publisher, you know, we'd make all these bells and whistles on our electronic products and found out that the customers didn't want bells and whistles because they had to learn something new. They just wanted really simple Google search and interoperability. And we all know on a rational level we need to get past that, but we still haven't really done that.
I guess I'd like to offer the idea that there's actually some upside here. So when we started to look at consumption patterns of Elsevier's content on Mendeley, and looking at just kind of what I would call private use case consumption, so in my personal reference manager library and within private collaboration groups, so not sharing publicly on the internet or anything like that, we found that as a percentage of Science Direct, Elsevier's primary publishing platform usage, there was probably something like low single digits of the Science Direct consumption happening on Mendeley. So something under 10% of what we see on Science Direct is also being consumed on Mendeley of Elsevier's content. So there's consumption there and there's usage there. And I think if we can be researcher focused and start to understand the patterns of where are researchers consuming our content, recognizing that it might be different in arts and humanities versus the hard sciences, etc., and start to look at where that consumption's happening and start to measure it, I think there's upside for publishers here. I think there's real usage that can be captured and then reflected back in institutional monetization discussions and monetized. And I think that's a real positive.
Yeah, let me just... Lest you think I'm being dire, I am actually being the opposite. So if you get back to my original talk, the 8,700 organizations in 113 countries, what are they? Those are organizations buying articles at publisher set pricing on demand through us. There's a lot of money here if you get in the workflow. And, you know, the good thing for our users is they wouldn't be our customers if they weren't hyper vigilant about copyright and legal compliance. So we have this group that they really, really want to give everyone the legal copy and get mad if someone goes anywhere else. But you do still have to get it to them in the workflow. But there's money here. There's a lot of money.
Of course, I agree with all that you said, guys. So just want to add the example of the music industry with Spotify, and maybe the usage is a little bit different, I think, in the research industry. So of course, if you want to listen music, you connect to Spotify and you listen music, and maybe you share a song or things like that. In research, and depending the fields you work in, there is really different usage of what you want to do with the result you find, and so maybe the features that you put on your platform will be also something very crucial. So my recommendation will be that be open to all the initiatives that happen now, and don't be shy. I think maybe some will work, some other will not work, but you're most of the time quite strong, and do not be too slow. I think I heard that this morning. I think Judy says that, and I think it's now that the change is happening. So it's very important to be here and to take decision.
Sorry, there's been some. One of the themes that I think I've heard a lot about over the last 45 minutes or so is monetization, right? There's a sense that there are publishers are leaving money on the table in one way of thinking if they're not engaging in some of these opportunities. And I wonder if we could talk just a little bit more about that, because I'm hearing, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding where you're seeing that. I'm hearing on the one hand there are the case where the user doesn't have an entitlement to, I think, or isn't covered by a license agreement, and therefore there's a sort of marginal opportunity to do some kind of sale or other transaction. I've heard that from several of you. Are there other kinds of monetization opportunities floating around here that we should get on the table? Because I don't think we've been specific about any others, if you see any others than that.
I'd be interested in hearing what the rest of the panel thinks, but I think when I think about it, as I said before, for us it's less about supporting sort of unsubscribed customer monetization, but more capturing and providing data that can help publishers in two ways. Number one, just understanding how content that they have published is being consumed and getting some insight out of that. I think a lot of publishers look at citation patterns to try to understand, what's hot, what's going on, what should I publish more or less of. Readership patterns are much earlier and much quicker than that, and generally a good indicator of long-term citation potential and interest value. So the data can be useful to publishers in that way, helping to shape a publisher program. And then I think what we are seeing with Sci-Hub and ResearchGate and others is there's a lot of usage leakage, we call it, off the publisher platform, and being able to put some of that back for publishers to be able to then reinforce their existing value proposition at the institution, I think is important data for publishers to have. So I don't know that it's necessarily about more money, but it's certainly about reinforcing existing monetization from my point of view.
Yeah, you hit my number one, which is data signals. So right now, all the data signals that are being lost, how you convert those data signals into money versus business opportunity versus better editorial versus whatever, there are different variations. But one is the loss of data signals. There's definitely money in helping build the workflow tools. So again, like the example I gave, where our corporations, for us, helping them take the stuff that they own that they'll never publish and using that to make your materials more valuable, because now they can compare them and collapse them and look for patterns and things like that. So there's opportunities in there. There's also opportunities, again, it's not direct monetization, but indirect monetization, particularly for OA. So yes, in an OA world, a CC BY article can migrate anywhere, but then of course you're losing some of the data signals, and if you can have that traffic coming to you, that again is extremely useful. So I would say the number one is the data signals.
Yeah, I agree. I see two opportunities. So the first one I just mentioned is futures that you put on your platform. So you develop on your platform, so you can sell it at the researcher level or institutional level. I think there is different way of selling that. And the other one is, of course, data. And you can provide a lot of data analysis, insights, and metrics. And you can provide it at different levels as well, at the researcher level, but also institutional. And when I talk about institutional, it could be academics or publishers, of course.
So in Judy's talk around the North Star, a number of the questions were around who is the North Star? Is it the researcher? Is it the library? One of the things that has struck me in talking with a lot of libraries lately is around how they feel like they're struggling to keep researchers on the right paths and becoming increasingly disintermediated themselves. And it's a combination of things that compound. You have lower usage that then makes it more difficult for the libraries to justify increases to their own budget, which in turn goes back to you. And so there's a lot of the pushback coming from libraries is, I think, a reflection of their relevance and ability to stay in the center of what researchers are consuming. So I think it's all very much the same problem. And so it's not just a function of kind of increasing data, which is absolutely important and will eventually drive the success, but I think it's also a function of how do we serve our customers, which is not just the researcher, but the library, with the industry tools that will enable them to continue to serve that time-honored function that they're serving and be able to justify to their administration at the universities or at the companies that we are indeed serving this. We have usage that is growing, thus justifying increases in our budget, et cetera. That may be a little simplistic, but I do think it cuts to a lot of it. I hear that a lot from libraries, that they don't have the data of their own to justify any sort of increases in their own expenditures, and then that contracts site license subscriptions and then pushes them into the Doc-Del mindset. And so I think we need to play with a couple of these variables at the same time, but I would start with how do we enable the libraries to be more successful with their mission, and go from there.
So I'm going to ask one final question that I think gathers up some of the way that publishers might want to engage in this, and then we'll have a few minutes if there are questions from others that you'd like to ask of the panel. when publishers run their own content platforms, content distribution platforms, obviously they spend a great deal of money on those platforms, and the other channels in all sorts of sectors, not just in publishing, other channels for distribution of apps or what have you. There are models that sort of take a cut of the sale, right? That's a business model for off platform distribution. At the same time, some of the workflow tools that we're all thinking about in our community have business models of their own that don't necessarily require that kind of an approach. Is there a principle here? I mean, should publishers expect to pay to have their content distributed in these new models? Should they expect to be paid a fee by some of these channels, or is this just a kind of totally, should we be really just expecting a totally neutral role, a sort of no fee either direction kind of role? I mean, maybe there's no principle here, but I'd like to hear a little bit about how publishers should be thinking about the costs that they may experience here, or the revenue benefits for that matter.
So I don't know if this directly answers your question, but I'm going to say you're going to get nowhere in business if you don't have a WIFM. What's in it for me? And the most obvious and easy WIFM to explain, as much as we talk about data signals and how valuable they may or may not be, is cash, right? So if you are looking to aggregate, if you're looking to sell someone else's stuff, then you got to be able to give them some money back, and you also have to keep enough money to make it worth your while. And so no matter how it is, whether, look, everyone here who participates with CCC knows, what do? We try to make money for you, and we keep a cut of it. And if both of those things didn't happen, something would fall apart, no question. So, I think you have to look at each business model. I mean, at the end of the day, you're splitting revenue, whether you're paying someone and then they're giving you more revenues as a result. At the end of the day, you're just splitting up dollars. And if it's not really clear what each party's getting out of that deal, then you got to be really, really nervous about that deal. So, and I think dollars are really simple.
But that implies that, I mean, that's one model where that channel is selling something on behalf of the content owner. That may not be there may be other, I think there may be other models represented.
Yeah, I suppose there are models that are, giving you exposure, but at the end of the day, what's at the end of that exposure? Hopefully a sale or a license, some sort of cash. So, I don't know.
I can say it's been something very much on my mind, this particular question, over the last year as we were developing the Anywhere Access program. Historically, we've done a number of different e-commerce models with a couple of publishers in the room on various topics, and always there has to be a win-win scenario for both parties involved to make it sustainable and successful. But it's also sometimes been a barrier because you, as a third party, can sometimes, I've been told by some of you, be seen to be sort of interfering, possibly playing at the same table with your site license sales reps and so forth. And so there's a very natural and understandable kind of concern about multiple players selling to the same customers about similar types of content licensing arrangements. It was with that in mind that we kind of made a conscious decision with Anywhere Access to push it as a library IT solution, not as a publisher revenue share program. And the reason we thought at first it wasn't that logical, because actually we work much more closely with a lot of you as publishers over the years. But actually thinking about it from an IT perspective, it fits into the body of library tools that they're already paying for, such as link resolvers, knowledge bases, easy proxies, and all of that. And it actually kind of clicked once it occurred to us that this made some sense, because it was a way that we could provide a set of technology tools that empower libraries to become more connected with their researcher journeys, and provide a more of a pass-through entity for subscriptions and potentially additional on-demand delivery formats. And so a number of you are probably familiar with some of the discussions we've been having on various topics there. But it's, I think there are different ways that you can structure it, since there are multiple buyers effectively in this scenario. And hopefully a couple of different approaches tell us different things about kind of what the dynamics will yield.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're not in the business of reselling other people's content and taking a cut. That's not our business model. So, to answer your question, not for us, no.
Yeah.
Okay, I see there's a couple of hands, and I think we have about 10 minutes or so. So is that right? Great.
Since Roy's on the panel, I have a question, and I'm actually surprised it hasn't come up at all yet in this meeting. I hope it does come up. And that's the concept of who owns the scientific data, not the reprint, not the envelope, but the data itself. Because I don't know if you're aware of the Chinese government mandate that came out a month ago regarding the submission of Chinese-funded data to a Chinese repository prior to publication. Are you aware of the mandate?
No, but
Okay.
I am
So-
now.
So the Chinese government has come out with a mandate a month ago, and it's an open public mandate, and they're going to, and the mandate shows that they're going to give all the money that's necessary to do it. And basically it requires any researcher in China, they can publish their stuff worldwide, but before the paper goes to publication, the researcher has to submit the scientific data to a government repository. And the government is going to reserve the right to publish that data, to charge fees for access to that data, and just talking about the data itself. So it really brings into question a lot of things, the disruption that Judy was talking about this morning, the fact that we need to act quickly to define what data is and who owns it. From a copyright perspective, and this is the question for you, from a copyright perspective, if that's true, and my interpretation of the mandate is true, how does that affect the copyright of the paper when in fact the figures and data and everything in the paper is being archived and owned technically by the Chinese government for Chinese papers?
Yeah, so this gets into a lot of wonky answers about copyright. So to begin with, copyright protects expression, not facts. So so if we get back to, is there copyright protection in that data in the first place? So remember I said, everyone wants to cover data, but data could be a photograph. Well, a photograph's protected by copyright. If data is, an IR spectra or a graph of temperature change, it's not protected by copyright. There are some vague rules around that, and EU has some protection, but it isn't really ownable as an intellectual property if it's just factual data in the first place. Now, most researchers will say, I own my data, and that's not a statement of copyright law. That's a statement of they created this, and they believe that that is their career. And what's very interesting to me, I always think that open access to articles happens before open data, not because funders and everyone wanted articles open. They really wanted data open, but that was so much harder. At the end of the day, authors, some authors really, really love open access. Some authors really, really hate it. Most of them don't really care because what they've written in the article is something they've put out in the public record, and they've moved on, and this is their statement. Their data, well, that's stuff that they did as a postdoc, and they want to make a career, keep publishing more and more stuff out of that data. And if there's an open data requirement, now their competitors, whoever they are now going to have access to it. And so, what I've heard from researchers is they really care a lot more about data, and they don't want it to be open. Now, I'm sure there are open data researchers, no question, but it gets a lot more complicated. What I would say is, more interestingly, is the power dynamic, because at the end of the day, we've seen this in open access. The person who funds the research, and in this case, if it's the government of China, they have a lot of power to basically say, if you want to get more money, this is what you do. And we as publishers, we will never be able to fight the power dynamic of the person who's actually paying the researcher to do the research. It's just, we're mismatched.
I just want to get her in before we do a comment, right?
If anybody's interested in the mandate, I have an English translation.
Cool. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Angela Cochran from the American Society of Civil Engineers. I've been sitting here talking myself into and out of asking this question for the entire session, and my head, there's like a lot going on in my head. But one of the things that, when it comes to access and ease of access for people at institutions that I keep butting up against is what impediment might the really large discovery platforms be? So the libraries complain often about how cumbersome some of these big platforms are, that it requires lots of resources to keep them updated, that they have to train students on how to, and faculty on how to use them to find content. At the same time, we know that the students are using Google Scholar, finding the DOI, and either going back to the platform or going to Sci-Hub to find it. Library budgets are shrinking and they're spending tons of money on these platforms, and yet the publishers are the ones who get vilified for increasing OAs and subscription costs. So my question was, are the large library discovery platforms the elephant in the room when it comes to access issues? And when I posted that to Twitter, our friend Rick Anderson said, or are they the dead, stinking carcasses of the elephant in the room? So, any thoughts on that?
It's a wonderful observation. Having had the privilege of integrating with some of these systems over the last year or so, I can tell you that it's interesting. There's a lot of legacy data, and through no fault of anyone's in particular, and not even the vendors. You have these scenarios where libraries have accumulated holdings over many years through various syndication packages or subscription agents and a number of different things. So it's sufficiently complex that a lot of these tools are trying to encompass an undue amount of complexity, actually, in a lot of ways. One general suggestion that would be wonderful in a piece of this equation is actually individualized KBART files, being able to distribute subscription holdings from the publisher, not just for the large packages, but also at an individual level. Not every publisher does that, and that's something that would solve it. One of the just interesting anecdotes to tell you is we found that there's a lot of drift in knowledge bases. That's probably not a surprise to most people, but a significant amount of drift, which is to say that if you ask a library link resolver or their knowledge base directly, do they have a subscription to a particular journal, volume, issue, article, et cetera, there's a reasonable chance that that's not correct. And it could be because it was merged incorrectly or they put in some OA data source that overwrote. Anyway, there's a number of annoying things in there. So long story short, it is a problem, but I think that there are definitely solutions that can be working both with the existing systems and maybe kind of migrating towards maybe a more elegant long-term goal that is a combination of some of these CPE, DUL, other sort of initiatives that this group has, and maybe some short-term solutions where we can kind of pilot solutions immediately and work towards that future state.
Hi, Christine Orr with Ringgold.
You want to take that one?
Hi, Christine Orr with Ringgold. And Rob and Gaby, you brought this up earlier, the issue of entitlements and licenses being a barrier. And one of the things that we do is we help customers kind of clean up their customer data. However, after 15 years of looking at everyone's customer data, we still have a lot of customer data that's really print-oriented, meaning, hey, where am I going to send that invoice, rather than, hey, who's included under this license? And as our licenses are more and more complex, we've moved far beyond site licenses. There's multi-sites and consortia, and this department bought it, but the whole place gets accessed. And oh yeah, by the way, that lab, we're going to loop you in too. And one of my most sophisticated customers, I said, well, do you capture who's in the license? He says, it's either on a piece of paper in a file cabinet or it's right here. And I just like shuddered. So I just there were a lot of kind of barriers for us collectively to get the right content to the right people at the right time. But this foundational data element has been something that we just see again and again. So I guess it's a plea for codifying those entitlement structures at a lot of different levels.
I echo and sympathize / empathize with everything you just said. The one thing that's kind of interesting I can share is that one of the neat things about one of the approaches that wasn't by design but kind of worked out by fortunate happenstance is that every time someone attempts to access something through the system that we've been working with libraries called the Anywhere Access Program, whenever something fails to download from the publisher, we're recording that. And so there's now kind of like an empirical log of all the things that they thought they had access to that they do not. And it's happening in real time organically as people consume content. So it's actually kind of proven to be a fortunately useful feature for libraries to go back and look at their holdings. Sometimes the holdings are incorrect. Sometimes maybe it's mislabeled. It's actually in an aggregator service, not a direct publisher relationship. Or maybe it was never enabled by the publisher. It happens. So there are a number of different circumstances that can lead to those dead ends. But those dead ends are the reason that researchers are going away from these systems, because link resolvers, like you said, it'll go to print, it'll go to any number of places. You get this maze that a researcher is baffled by, and then the next thing you know, they're copying and pasting and going somewhere else. So,
just a quick comment, Chris Shillam from Elsevier, comment, plug, rather than a question in response to those last two comments. In the wonderful world of alphabet soup of all of these infrastructure standards we're trying to build, there is a NISO working group called KBART's Automation, which is trying to solve exactly that problem, title level holdings files, which can be automatically sucked into ERM systems, search platforms, etc. So if you don't know about that, take a look, and I'm sure they welcome more folks getting involved to make that happen.
that's great.
That was your plea, right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to join. Yeah.
This is a good time to say thank you to this terrific panel, to Todd Toller and Darrell for helping us organize it, and thank you, everyone.